Wednesday evenings with The Case for Christ. We're going to go through the book The Case for Christ and try to learn some more ways on how to defend Christ, basically him coming to earth, defending the Bible, defending his story, proving that he is true and existed and came from God, these types of things. So I wanted to mention that this morning before we got started. Just an interesting study. We have books in the back if you're interested in that, and feel free to join us on Wednesday evenings to go through that study. But this morning we want to look at perfected through weakness. This is something that is really a topic of the New Testament, but we want to look at it in terms of Abraham because I think it's something that we can see throughout the entirety of the Bible. So perfected through weakness, that comes from 2 Corinthians. So we're going to start there. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9. Let's go ahead and read that. We'll actually back up and go ahead and read from verse 7. So this is Paul speaking. He says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" And this was true of Paul, and it is true of us as well, and that's why we're studying it this morning. And it's also true of Abraham, who we're going to look at in depth this morning. To me, it's even more impressive that God was able to execute his will through people who were not perfect, right? Through imperfect people. We look at the Old Testament, as we're going to with this, just the story of Abraham, but in general, all of the stories of the Old Testament, you do not see a wonderful depiction of these individuals who God was working through, right? They all had issues, flaws, made mistakes, sometimes even did things God really didn't want them to do. It's something we see throughout the Old Testament. So it's even more impressive that he was able to bring Jesus, as we were just talking about the case for Christ, bring Jesus into the world to live that perfect life through all of these imperfect people, basically making these prophecies that turned out to be true, proving that he was truly God. However, the people he used along the way were not, the perfect examples of good, godly people. And we couldn't do this even if we were working together. Put something so complex as what we see in the Bible, bringing Christ to the world and being able to reveal God to the world in such a way. We couldn't do this even if we were trying really hard. We definitely wouldn't try to do it by showing love through imperfectness, right? We would try to make it perfect. That's what we try to do, right? In all the things we work through in life, we want to make things perfect. But God was able to do it through free will, through imperfection. And Abraham, even though he's known as the father of the faithful, which I wanted to take a second because I tried to look up where that is in the Bible, and it's not very direct. It's not as direct as I thought, as far as I could find. But closest thing I could get was Romans 4, chapter 9, or Romans chapter 4, verse 9, where it says, reading through verse 11, it says, "Is the blessing then only for the circumcised, or also the uncircumcised? For we say, the faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as the seal of righteousness, that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so the righteousness would be counted to them as well." So there we see the father of all who believe, or the father of the faithful. This is a pretty great title, right? This is something you would expect for a great man to receive, someone who truly exemplified the things of God. And this is true of Abraham. We're going to look at the good and the bad this morning, but it should make us feel very comfortable with our mistakes. We were talking about this morning and perfectly dovetailed with this morning's class, how we're given temptations and trials because even if we fail, we learn something. We learn how to be better, the things we need to work on, the things we need to study, and we can see that's what Abraham did as well. So let's go ahead and look at the story of Abraham. We're going to start where the Bible starts in Genesis chapter 12. We're going to pick up there in the first verse. And of course, during the first part of his life, Abraham was known as Abram. So that's what we're going to see in the verses that we're going to read. So in Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and to your kindred, and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So to sum this up in kind of modern terms, it's basically God saying, trust me, do these hard things that I've asked you to do, and I will bless you. And he lays out some of the promises that we know to be associated with Abraham right here in these first three verses, the first three verses of Abraham's story in the Old Testament. He's going to make him a great nation. That's the first one we see here. And then all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I think we see this in the fulfillment in the coming of Christ. That is what God's talking about here. How are all families, not just his family, but all families going to be blessed is because the Savior is going to come from Abraham's lineage. But moving on here to see what this impressive feat is that Abraham did to begin his life, the good of Abraham, it says, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran." So we see here God says, do these hard things. He said, leave everything you know. Leave where you live. Leave all of your family behind and go to a place I will show you. It doesn't even say he said what that place was. He just said, go. I'll show you where it is. And Abram, he said, okay, let's go. He got up and he went. And I think here we could take some from how old he was. He was 75 years old. So when we think about that, it's a little bit tricky to think about age in the Old Testament, right? They lived a little bit longer than we do today. So what does this really mean? It would be a little bit different. So if we turn over to Genesis 25, 7 and 8, we can see how long Abraham lived and kind of the length of his story. This is going to be kind of the end of his story. We just looked at the beginning in chapter 12. And then in chapter 25, in verse 7 and 8, it says, "These were the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." So we can see here that he lived about 175. And if you scale that out, since he said he was an old man, it doesn't say he was ancient or anything like that. That means it would be like a 32-year-old leaving home, right? In terms of spryness, assuming they aged about the same as we did today. So when we say that he left at 75, let's not think about a 75-year-old that we would think of leaving home today. He was probably in a little better health than generally we are at age 75. And as we know, that's almost the extent of life. The average life expectancy, I think, is pretty close to 75 nowadays, which clearly here, 175, he had quite a bit of life to live, right? However, even though we're saying he might have felt about 32 years old, living to 75 is going to have a lot of impact on how settled you are, right? I'm not quite to 32 yet, but at 75, I probably have settled quite well into wherever I'm going to stay for my life, right? 75 years of building up, let's assume, his abode there in Haran with his family, right? He had settled in quite nicely, I would imagine. And however, he just gets up and is ready to go for God, to leave this established place. So it is a little bit different than just considering that he might have felt 32 years old. He's clearly established in that area, right? Another thing I think is interesting is he just went, and we don't have any evidence of him complaining right away of where he was sent or any complaints at all, really. We talked about complaints in the class this morning as well. We're not supposed to be murmuring or grumbling, but there's some things that he probably could have been grumbling about, which I thought was interesting as well. If we look at Genesis, let's turn back to Genesis chapter 12 where we started out and scroll down to verse 6 there. It's kind of a passing statement, but it says, "Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak tree of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land." Again, pretty interesting. We touched on some of this in the class this morning. But let's think about what that statement means. The Canaanites were in the land, right? These are the same Canaanites that the children of Israel encountered when they came out of the land of Egypt with Moses, right? And we mentioned that, but let's go ahead and turn back to Numbers 13, where they're spying out the land, looking to take it. God said to Abraham, "I'm going to give you this land." That's one of the promises that he was given. And he comes to it, and what does he find? He doesn't find an empty land ready to be taken, right? He finds a land full of Canaanites. as he just mentioned. And it says in verse 28 in Numbers, when his descendants were about to take the land, or were being told to spy it out, to prepare to take it, the spies said, "However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land, and the Negab, and the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." And then skipping down to verse 32, because we're just looking at the men, or the people that were there, what they were facing. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land, saying they had spied it out. The land through which we had gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So when Abraham would have came to this new land that God showed him, he would have saw these giants, basically, is what he's saying there. That's what they're talking about with the Nephilim, people who are large, men of war. We think of people like Goliath and things from the story of David, people who were, scary to face. And we see these fortified cities, right, that Abraham may have experienced as well. In addition to that, and this land that God had sent him to, if we continue back to Genesis chapter 12, looking at verse 10, not only were all these people in the land, there was a famine in the land as well, right? It said now there was a famine in the land. So Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. However, Abram is someone we want to be like, right? Because we don't see anything about something like Job might have said, where he said, "Why was I born?" Or these other complaints that the Israelites had that we detailed this morning, as they were literally being taken care of by God. And they were complaining, we don't have any bread, or we have bread, but we don't have any meat. And he gave them meat. And there were complaints all through basically the trip out of after the Red Sea, these great events that we saw. They continued to complain, but Abram did not, right? Even though he saw all these things, he just made do. He went down to Egypt, as we're going to look at next. So Abram is doing pretty well up to this point, right? He's someone we want to be like, but we can see that he had some problems as well, and that's what we want to look at. God's made perfect in weakness, and one of Abram's weaknesses was his fear. He had some fear. We can see this because he continually lied to rulers because of his fear. He was afraid of what would happen to him. Even though we just read at the top of Genesis chapter 12, it says in verse 3 there, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So he should have known he had the protection of God. God literally told him, "I'm going to protect you. I'm going to curse those who dishonor you. I'm going to protect you," is what he's saying there. But we can see down here, after he's journeyed through the land which God sent him, we pick up in verse 11 to a story that doesn't show as well against Abraham. It says, "And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, 'I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, This is his wife. Then they will kill me, and they will but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake.' When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants and female donkeys and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, 'What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go.' And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had." So we can see here that even though God told Abram that he was going to be protected, and that's exactly what God did, we can see here, he had nothing to fear. Abram didn't believe. He had this fear that he was going to be killed because of the beauty of his wife. And I think this is interesting. We can see that Abram's just starting his journey. He took a great leap of faith when he left his family, right, and went into this land. He saw the land, but you can see maybe his faith is beginning to waver a little bit. Is God really with me? Does God really know what he's doing, sending me to this land with the Nephilim and with these great cities, these great people in a famine? Is this really, should I be following what God's saying? He begins to waver here, and we see in Pharaoh. However, after even everything that he went through in the next few chapters, we're going to skip ahead to Genesis chapter 20, and we see some great acts of faith before Genesis chapter 20 that we're going to look into, but we can see here that he makes the same mistake again. He didn't learn his lesson, and that's what we're studying these things for, is we need to learn from our mistakes. You would think when God sent these plagues that is written there in Genesis chapter 12 that he would say, okay, God is going to watch over me, right? He is going to protect me. I know this to be true because he's done it for me already once. But we see almost the same story unfold in Genesis chapter 20, this time with a different ruler, Abimelech. And it says here, and Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, so at this point he's become Abraham. He's grown a lot. He's become even closer to God. And again, we already saw that he was protected by God. But again, they come here to Gerar, and Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman who you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So we can see here, one thing we can take from this right away is Sarah must have been really beautiful, right? Because Abraham keeps going into these different kingdoms, and the king's like, I'm going to take her as my wife every single time. So maybe Abraham did have something to fear, because clearly she was very beautiful if these kings continue to try to take her as his wife. But he was underestimating God, and actually underestimating humanity as well, we can see, because Pharaoh didn't say he was going to kill him, right? He actually sent him away with all the possessions that he gave him, these types of things. And in addition, that's very similar to what happens here with Abimelech. God protects him once again, even though he didn't have the faith that he should have had in God. He comes to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, you have a man's wife. Don't do this. And Abimelech does the right thing, and we can see that if we go down to verse 9. It says in verse 9, then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? Very similar to what Pharaoh said. And now I have sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin. You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? And Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say, he is my brother. So we can see here this is something they had agreed to do. They did not accept the protection of God that God literally told them he would do. We have some protection from God. We have some peace by knowing that nothing in this earth is going to affect us because we know there's an afterlife, right? But God literally told Abraham, nothing in this life is going to affect you. I am going to be with you. I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who dishonor you, right? That was in the physical life that he was talking about there. So Abraham could have relied on that, but he still had fear, even after all the things he went through. So Abraham still struggled with faith. I think this is really important for us to understand and remember that even Abraham wasn't perfect, even though he conversed with God. We talked about that this morning too, the idea that if we could just see these miracles, we could speak directly with God, maybe we would be more apt to believe, right? The world around us would be more apt to believe, but we can see that's not the case. I mean, looking at the entirety of the Old Testament. They saw these things happen right in front of them. I mean, we talked about the children of Israel. They saw the Red Sea part. They saw the manna being given to them being sustained, and that wasn't enough to keep them believing in God. They turned away many times, time and time again. And same thing with even a good man like Abraham. He was not even fully convinced. He wavered back and forth. In addition to these things, Abraham had other doubts as well. So God had promised a great nation will come from him. We read that in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 2. We already went over that, but he had doubts in addition to that. We can turn it to Genesis chapter 15, going back in the story a little bit. One thing I left out, I want to make sure I'm not painting him too terribly here, is he did have faith. At one point, Lot's flocks and his oxen and things, they've grown to such a level that they couldn't stay together because they've been blessed with so many blessings. Then Abraham looks at Lot and says, you pick, which way will you go? And Lot took the more prosperous direction, right? He went towards Sodom and Gomorrah and to these areas that were better watered, these better areas. And Abraham said, no, I'll go over here if that's what you want. And of course, we know that Abraham knew or clearly had faith that God would sustain him. He wasn't worried about these things when he gave Lot the better land. He wasn't in it for worldly possessions either, right? If he was in it for worldly possessions, he would have tried to take that better land. But even with this faith that we can see Abraham still had, he still had doubts. And we read about those in Genesis chapter 15. So let's go ahead and look at that. So in Genesis 15, we'll just pick up with verse 1. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. So we're just talking about, how even in chapter 20, much past this, Abram's still making mistakes by saying, this is my sister. Here God is saying directly to him, fear not, I am your shield. But nonetheless, let's continue reading. It says, but Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven, and the number of the stars, if you are able to number them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So we can see here there was a doubt in Abraham. He was worried. He was seeing, I don't have a child. You're saying I'm going to be a great nation, but I don't even have one child, let alone my offspring are going to be a great nation. But we can see here that God reassures him, and he believes. So we can see that his faith wasn't completely gone. This wasn't something, that was completely bad about him, but it was clearly a doubt that he had. But even though he was assured for a time, we can see here in verse 7 that he again was having doubts. He said, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, so he gives him this sign basically in the next few verses. But for sake of time, I want to go ahead and skip down to verse 13. So he gives him a sign. He says, and the Lord said to Abraham in verse 13, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So we can see here God had a plan all along, and it wasn't for Abram to know the full extent. And that was getting Abraham really worried, right? When he couldn't see the end of the plan. And fortunately for him, God lays it out for him and just says, you're not going to see the end of the plan. That's not my plan for you. Your people are going to go into captivity even. We see that happening with the children of Israel being captives in Egypt of what's going to happen. But he reassures him. Well, we can see that even Abram had his doubts. And these continue to plague him. Clearly this Abram was pacified with God's answer here, saying that don't worry about it. It's going to come to pass after your death. You're going to go to your fathers in peace. But he still wasn't convinced that God was going to take care of things for him. And we can see that in Genesis chapter 16 as we continue to see this idea of doubt in Abram. So picking up in 16 verse 1, it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. So we were just talking about that, and God said, don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of it. But she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, and it may be that I shall obtain children by her. But Abram listened to the voice, Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abraham, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So we can see here they take matters into their own hands. They say, God said, you're going to have a great nation, so let's help him out. Let's go ahead and kind of do this workaround. You can take my servant, and I will produce children through her. But this wasn't the plan. And when we try to take things into our own hands like this, there are great consequences. And this is a great example of something really bad that came from Abraham. And let's continue reading now into verse 5 through 12 to read about what happened here. It says, And Sarai said to Abraham, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave you my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power, do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. And the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring was on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, the servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. And he shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So for those of you who don't know, I mean, this is the foreshadowing of a great nation. This isn't the great nation that was promised to Abraham. We're going to look at that in a minute in some of the faithful things that Abraham did. But Ishmael did grow into a great nation. And we can see that this is promised even once again in Genesis chapter 21. If we turn over there, after she was dealt harshly with when she was just having Ishmael in her womb, once again, we see problems arise from when we don't follow God's plan. And Genesis 21, verse 9, this kind of comes up again. It says, But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be the heir with my son Isaac. So we can see here what we're going to get to, that God did what he said. He gave Abraham a heir through Sarai, or Sarah as she would become known, just as God had said. But again, we see this problem of when we don't listen to what God wants us to do. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on the account of his son, Ishmael, is what the son is there. It says, But God said to Abraham, Do not be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a great nation, or I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So we can see here, God promises again directly to Abraham now, not just Hagar, that there will be a great nation. And what nation is that comes from Ishmael? And that is the nation of Islam. If we look back of Islam's origins, they cite right back to Ishmael. That is who they claim to be. And they claim the opposite of what the Bible says here, that Abraham's offspring, that were going to be blessed, that the salvation was going to come through, they claim that came from Ishmael. That is the claim of the nation of Islam, or Islamism. And that is what we can see here, that there are problems that happen when we don't obey God. God indeed made him a great nation, and he is a wild donkey man, as we read here in verse 16. Chapter 16, verse 12. As he says here, I think it's interesting, this quote that's in there. In verse 12 it says, His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. We can see the dysfunction in this nation, the nation of Islam. I think it perfectly fits what we read here. And we can see this is because of the mistakes that Abraham made trying to step in for God. But God can work through flawed people and mistakes, but those mistakes do have consequences. And we can see that he can work through flawed people because of what happens with Abraham's story. So, we've been dwelling on kind of the negative parts of Abraham's story, but when we think of Abraham, we think of a great man, right? And one of those things is, Isaac being the heir. Let's go ahead and explore that. Basically, what did happen in the end of Abraham's life. So in Genesis 17, let's turn to verse 18.
So Genesis 17, starting in verse 18. That reads, "And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." So once again, we see that allusion there to Islam, the nation of Islam being a large nation. But the promise was going to travel through Judaism, through Isaac. And we can see that's exactly what it did. But I wanted to mostly read this to show that there was no doubt that Isaac was the heir, right? We think about Adam and Eve, right? They had several children, of course, but the three we're most familiar with is Cain and Abel and Seth, right? And we might think that this was a situation where the heir of Abraham could have been a third child, right, like Seth. It wasn't Cain, equivalent to Ishmael here. And if Isaac was going to be sacrificed, as we're going to look at, maybe it could have been Seth, right? But that's not the option that we have here. God literally says it's going to be through Isaac. Isaac is the son. It isn't going to be some future heir that I'm going to provide you. It is going to be Isaac. And that's important for when we turn over to Genesis chapter 22 to look at the end of this story. Genesis 22, verse 2. Let's start with that. And it says exactly what we're talking about, the sacrifice of Isaac. And he said, God here, he said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So even though we know that Isaac is going to be the heir, not some future heir, not someone who's going to be born to Sarah after this, God says, "Go and sacrifice him to me." And we can see this is exactly what Abraham does if we turn down to verse 7. "And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. And when they came to a place which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, caught behind him was a ram, and caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So we can see here that Abraham learned his lesson, right? We talked about the doubts, the things that he did on the previous slide, all the doubt that he had, the doubt that he would become a nation, the doubt that he would be able to take the land, the doubt that Sarah would conceive him an heir, that he even went around and tried to conceive through Hagar to produce this heir. But he learned his lesson here. And we can see that fully explained in Hebrews. So for the last section of the lesson this morning, let's turn over to Hebrews and look at what's said about him in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about men of faith, he has a pretty lengthy section as we look at, starting in verse 8. But specifically, let's look down a little farther here and specifically pull out what we're talking about here. You know, we talked about a lot of his story already, which the great faith that he had, which it cannot be doubted. But let's go ahead and just pick up in verse 8, and it says, By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out of the place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. And by faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even though she was past the age, since she was considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as innumerable the grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeting them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking the homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." So once again, he knew it was coming through Isaac. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So we can see here that Abraham's faith had grown to a great extent. He no longer doubted God. He thought that even if he went through the act, which he was willing to do, that God would be able to bring him back, and the promises would be fulfilled no matter what. And we should have this faith as well. When we have doubts like Abraham, let's remember what God has done for us and what God has done through people who have shown doubt. Doubt is not something we're going to be able to avoid. Even we can see in Abraham where God literally told him, "I'm going to protect you." He had this doubt. We must make sure that we learn from the mistakes of our own lives and also the mistakes Abraham made, that we get to this level of faith and ask ourselves now as we conclude this lesson, do we have this level of trust that no matter what, God's will be fulfilled through us? Even if it comes to this, comes to something that seems impossible, do we believe that God will continue to work, that he will save us, and that we will someday raise and be with him? I ask you to consider this as we turn to the invitation now. We have the opportunity to be saved. We need to trust God. We need to have this level of faith that Abraham had in the end of his life. He has given us the opportunity for salvation if we hear, believe, repent, change, make best on our mistakes, confess, showing that we believe, and be baptized, and then stay faithful throughout our lives. We have the ability to come back to God as well if we fall short at any time, just like Abraham did in his life. If we find ourselves doubting, see the mistakes that we have made, we can repent and pray for forgiveness. And of course, we can lean on our brothers and sisters as well for help. So I encourage you this morning, if we can help you in any way, to come forward now as we stand and sing the invitation song.